Hello and welcome to today's webcast, Intercepting WannaCry, a deep dive into Wave 1 of the Shadow Brokers fallout. I am joined today by Joe Levy, Chief Technology Officer, and Marty Ward, Vice President of Product Marketing. Just a few items before we begin. We'd like to make today's session as interactive as possible, so please send any questions or comments throughout the webinar to our console here, and we will answer them towards the end of the broadcast. Today's session will be recorded and an email will be sent to you later tomorrow with a link to the on-demand recording. All right, Marty, let's talk ransomware. Over to you.
All right, thanks so much, Chantel. And thanks everyone for joining us here today. Joe Levy, the Chief Technology Officer of Sophos, is here to take you through the anatomy of this attack, but I'm going to start with the next slide here, just to give you a quick overview of, so if Joe, if you could just advance quickly there. There you go, thank you. Just a quick introduction as we get started here. So I'm sure many of you have heard what's going on. Many of you, have at least a high-level understanding of what's happening. Probably some of you have a very deep level. But, whether it's called WannaCry or WannaCryptor or WannaDecryptor, there's many names floating around. But we're going to go through the details. Of course, it's a ransomware attack. It's encrypting files and demanding a ransom like a typical ransomware attack. But unlike a typical ransomware attack, it is not spreading via phishing or any kind of traditional means like that. It is actually spreading as a worm, exploiting a vulnerability called Eternal Blue. So this is a very different approach. We haven't seen something like this in a little while, but it's really interesting. And so this vulnerability, this exploit was leaked in recent years, and Joe's going to go through the timeline for you. But it exploits a weakness in the Microsoft Server Message Block. SMB has been tossed around a lot this week, as you'll see. Microsoft patched it actually back a couple months ago, but lots of companies, of course, don't apply patches right away. So you'll see that timeline also. And although XP in 2003 weren't originally patched because those aren't the current operating systems, it of course affects those operating environments, so they had to go back and patch those as well. We saw the outbreak start around lunchtime Friday in the UK, so that would have been very early morning here in the US for us. And organizations around the world were affected. At first, it looked like it was some sort of attack on the UK, and very quickly we realized this was going worldwide. So so far, over 150 countries have reported, that they were affected. So very high-level overview for you there, but we're going to spend the next several minutes having Joe Levy, our CTO, run through the details of what actually happened. So, Joe, happy to pass to you. Welcome.
Thanks, Marty. Hello, everyone. Thanks for joining us today. I'm Joe Levy. Let me begin by taking you through the events that led up to the event. And we have to go way back to about 2013 here. There's an unknown period of time where a set of tools that the NSA had purportedly created for spycraft were stolen. Nobody is entirely sure how that happened, but we know that it occurred within this window between 2013 and August of 2016. In August of 2016, an organization called the Shadow Brokers emerged, and shortly thereafter, they began to make available the set of tools that they had claimed were stolen from the NSA. At approximately the same time, Microsoft learned from some party that these weapons had been stolen and that they were going to be leaked. And then something unusual happened, and some of you probably recall this. For the very first time in history, in February, Microsoft canceled Patch Tuesday, and everyone in the industry knew that something unusual was going on. Almost concurrently, we in the industry began to see the very, very first samples of WannaCry being submitted up into the VirusTotal community. Now, at the time, we couldn't anticipate that these two events were going to come together in any way, but with retrospection, we have the ability now to understand how the two are going to interplay. At about the same time as we saw the very first samples, Sophos introduced some generic detections for the WannaCry family, and at the same time, Invincia, the machine learning technology that we've recently acquired, also demonstrated the ability to detect the very earliest samples. In March of 2017, Microsoft released a set of patches with Security Advisory MS-17-010, and there were a number of very, very critical fixes that were included in there. so critical that they couldn't have emphasized enough the need for organizations to respond to them. May 12th, we saw the WannaCry outbreak begin, and this was the coupling of the WannaCry ransomware along with the methods of propagation that were leveraging the NSA tools that would exploit the targets. And then May 13th, Microsoft, in another unprecedented move, decided to release updates for the unsupported operating systems, Windows XP and 2003 Server. Now we'll move on to the anatomy of the actual attack. There were three primary stages here. First involved penetration. That is, how is the exploit code going to get into the target environment? And there were a few interesting characteristics. One is that it was remote code execution. So it was something that was launched at the target without the target having to interact with the malicious code in any way. Next is that it was kernel level. It operated on ring 0, which immediately meant that it had elevated privileges within the operating system. And then immediately upon infection, it would begin propagation. And this is the worm-like characteristic that we saw that enabled it to spread as far and wide as it did, as quickly as it did. Once it was in an environment, it began the deployment stage, and it went through the process of unpacking itself, preparing the environment for the delivery of the actual payload, and then the execution of the various stages of the payload itself. And then finally, it moved on to the final stage, encryption, and it sought out a set of documents on the operating environment that it had infected. We'll look at those in a little more detail. It made sure that it deleted any kind of shadow copies or backups that might have existed on the system. And then it displayed the call to action or the ransom note to the victim. So let's move on to stage 1 penetration. Starting at the left, we believe that it began with an infected host that was propagating itself over the internet. And just how that happens, we'll look at in a little more detail further on. So this was an SMB packet with shellcode and the payload. It came in over SMB on port 445, and it was serviced by the kernel level SMB driver, SRV2.sys. Now, if this was a target that was still vulnerable to MS-17-010, that is, any version of Windows post Vista that hadn't applied the patches, or any version of XP or 2K3 server, it was susceptible to this attack. The injection occurred through an APC call, which is an asynchronous procedure call, and these can happen in either user space or in kernel space. And this particular one began in the kernel and then moved to user space. And the payload that it initially dropped was a launcher.dll. And within this DLL file, there was a resource whose name was mssec.svc.exe. And when this would execute, it would install itself as a service, and then it would execute, and it would start up a couple of threads, which are diagrammed over here. If you go to the right, you'll see that it would begin the scanning process, and we'll talk a little bit more about the propagation that would occur on the network, because there was both local network and remote network or across the internet propagation. And then the other thread was the drop in execution, and this was of the next component, which is tasksched.exe. Now, the propagation itself is interesting because if you go back and look through the history of some of the earlier samples of WannaCry that we saw, this wasn't the only method of propagation. When the attackers were first experimenting with this, and we go back to approximately February, we see that the original method of spread was through IPC. This is the inter-process communication, the hidden share that exists on most Windows systems, and it would attempt to spread itself that way. But this particular variety that we saw would spread, we believe, exclusively through SMB. There's been a lot of speculation in the industry about how did it get into the environment in the first place. Was it through the web or through phishing or email, some of the more common methods of propagating malware? The entire industry at this point has no indication that it came in through any of those methods. Therefore, we're led to believe that SMB was, in fact, the method of propagation. Now, this was leveraging one of the approximately 30 exploit tools that were leaked in that Shadow Brokers leak from the Equation Group or from the NSA. And the particular exploit technique that was used here was referred to as Eternal Blue. This is just one of a number of different Eternal family exploits, and we'll have a little bit of a look at those a little later on. Now, this is the network propagation itself broken out. So after the preparation stage is run, which sets up networking, it generates and encrypts the launcher packet payload, because the payload itself, with the content within the packets itself, was encrypted. And if we look at the left side first, we see the internet attack thread, and it's quite sophisticated. First, it was multi-threaded, ran 128 parallel threads. Our analysis indicates that not all of the threads ran as designed. It was one of the many software flaws that existed in the software. But at least 32 of the threads did run correctly. What it would do is it would generate a random IP address, and then it would rotate through these addresses after it successfully made a connection to port 445 on the other end. And it obviously well designed here, because it was seeking locality. After it found a network where there was at least one susceptible victim, it figured there were probably other susceptible victims there as well, and it tried to stay local. And if it failed altogether to connect to that network, then it would just rotate through and start with an entirely new set of octets. On the local network attack, what it would do is it would just look for the local subnet, and then it would walk through the entire range of IP addresses on the subnet. We have no indication at this point that it tried to jump subnets within the local network. It just stayed within the broadcast domain. Next, we have the deployment stage. And here we've got that MSX service.exe that drops the task scheduler.exe. And there was encrypted content within here. Originally, researchers were quite excited when they found an embedded password that you could see there, WannaCry at 2017. They thought that that might be a password related to the decryption of the ransomware files, but in fact, it was just a password that was used to decrypt more of the resources that were component to the attack. And then if you look at the right side, you could see the inventory broken out. These are the various components that were decrypted from that archive that was in the task scheduled executable. So the bitmap file itself that had the instructions for the ransomware, they were courteous enough to go through and localize it for a variety of different languages so that the victim could understand it in their local language. There was an archive that in some variants of this contained the Tor components. In earlier variants, it would actually attempt to download the Tor components from a content delivery network, but the later variants actually had the Tor components embedded within it. And then a variety of other tools here. The Decryptor tool, which we'll spend a little more time on in just a moment, as well as some internal housekeeping components. And then other variants also had another piece that would allow for propagation within a terminal server and RDP environment, attempting to infect each of the individual sessions. It would do some other housekeeping work like setting up file permissions, decrypting components to move on to the next stage, and then setting up the Bitcoin address. And that is an interesting component by itself too. So here's stage 3, the encryption. These guys knew crypto pretty well, which is rather disappointing, because in many earlier crypto ransomware samples, we had seen that the encryption was not implemented correctly, and that led to people figuring out how to decrypt it and recover the files that way. Based on our analysis and the industry's best understanding of this particular attack, the crypto was strong enough that it appears to be irreversible at this point. Every single file was encrypted with its own 128-bit AES key, and it would actually use the Microsoft Crypto API CryptGen random call for this. So it was not using its own crypto, it was in fact using the Microsoft crypto components. The key itself was stored in each one of the encrypted files, and you could see the structure of the files themselves over here. And then there was a 2048-bit RSA key pair that was generated for every single victim. The public key was saved off into a local file, and the private key then was encrypted using a global hard-coded public key. So this is another asymmetric crypto public key encryption of that private key that is being generated. And then this gets sent up to the attacker when the victim pays. Now, the thing to keep in mind here is that that private key that would be necessary to decrypt the earlier stage key is only held by the attacker. It was not present in any of the samples, so there was absolutely nothing there for any researchers to extract. It was never present in memory. It just never appeared within the attack itself. So this walks through the set of files that were actually encrypted by the attack. You could see it's a pretty broad range. They would go after the usual suspects, things like media and documents, PowerPoints, music, etc. But if I could draw your eye to line 2 over here up at the top, you could see that there were some other interesting targets here. There were SQL databases that were targeted, and there was actually source code that was targeted as well with C and C++ files. And then if you look over here, you see that the database and the exchange platforms themselves were very specifically targeted, where the malware would attempt to kill processes. The list of processes that it attempts to kill is down here, but different types of SQL Server engines and different types of instances of Microsoft Exchange components. And the reason why I was doing this is because it was attempting to get exclusive access to the database files. It was being a little proactive and saying if I can't get exclusive access to a file, I might not be able to successfully encrypt it. Therefore, I'm going to try to kill the process that has a handle to it, and that way I'll have a better chance to succeed in the encryption. And then there were a set of exclusions that you could see up at the top where it figured I'd better not encrypt these files or I can do damage to the system that would prevent it from continuing to operate, and then the jig is up. So here's some additional post-encryption steps. One of the next thing it does is it drops the decryption program itself, and this is the now very familiar screenshot. This is how the victim would interact with the attacker if they sought to make payment in the hopes of actually getting their content decrypted. It would run a little batch file that would create a VB script, and the VB script would drop this little link icon, pretty ironically showing 2 people making some sort of a deal with a handshake there. And then it would run VSS admin, WMIC, BCD edit. It would delete shadow copies and attempt to delete any other local operating system backups that had been made to prevent recovery. The decryptor itself is shown over here, and we'll look at that in more detail in just a moment. Persistence is achieved by writing to the registry so that the decryptor would pop up again every time the system was rebooted. And then it would launch the Tor service when the user would interact with the decryptor itself. And it would seek to make connections to, as we understand, at least these 5 different onion addresses. This is the bitmap for the ransom note that was dropped after the infection, and provides instructions to the victim about how they might pursue getting their data back. Now, let me walk you through the intended decryption process. And the reason why we say intended is because it didn't work the way that it should. This is basically the same sort of crypto process that I described a moment ago, only in reverse now. So the encrypted victim's private key is sent to the attacker via Tor using that decryptor program. And the attacker ought to be able to decrypt that local private key with their secret master private key. Again, they're holding on to that RSA private key, and only that RSA private key should be able to decrypt this local private key. And if it had made it that far, then it moves on to step 3. The local private key is then used to decrypt the AES file for each file affected. So again, every single file has its own AES key that's embedded in the file itself. That key is encrypted using the victim's public key, and then only can it be decrypted when the attacker decrypts the key with their own private key. And then once payment is confirmed, the attacker would purportedly decrypt the local RSA key for the victim and start that process that I just described. But here's the catch. They messed up in the code. So the ransom payments generally in most ransomware campaigns that we've seen in the past used a unique Bitcoin address. And there are multiple reasons for this. One is it provides proof that the victim made payment. There are other ways to prove that the victim made payment, but this is administratively simpler. The other thing that it does is it makes it easier for the attacker to actually recirculate that Bitcoin, whether it's through mixers or conversion into other currency. When you have a small concentration of Bitcoin addresses, they attract a lot of attention. So they weren't using best practices for ransomware, let's put it that way. So it was possible within the code, through analysis it was determined that it was possible within the code to get it to generate a unique Bitcoin address on every single instance using this FI switch. The problem was that the malware called the decryptor with the FI switch before the decryptor was actually written to the target system. So the very first time it would call it, it would fail because the executable simply wasn't there. But subsequent attempts to call it and manually passing that FI switch into it demonstrated that you could in fact get it to generate unique Bitcoin addresses with the passage of that switch. Now, if the FI mode was invoked, this is what would happen. It would send the following information to the attacker. It would be the first 8 bytes of that resource file that was created along with the computer name, the username, and +++. And this was encrypted using the launcher.dll that we described earlier. And we've demonstrated that it would in fact get a unique Bitcoin address, and that this could have ostensibly made the decryption process possible. To date, there's really no strong evidence that decryptions have succeeded. There's been approximately $85,000 worth of payment that we have seen through the Bitcoin trackers that have been made to those 3 Bitcoin accounts. And there's a lot of real-time data that is unfolding right now. Earlier this morning, in fact, there was this unconfirmed claim that the attacker had gotten in touch through the decryptor's messaging system with one of the victims saying, hey, I've received your payment and I've already started the process of decrypting your files. The attacker further asked in that claim that victims attempt to contact the attacker directly to let him or her know that they're attempting to make payment so that he or she could be prepared to decrypt the files. Now, this was another interesting component, and this is the one where the researcher saves the world. It was discovered that there was what is being referred to now as a kill switch in this particular variant of WannaCry. The end-of-wild variants that we are seeing would abort if they succeeded in making a connection to any of the domains that we see, any of the first 2 domains that we see at the bottom over here. It's believed at this point that it wasn't intended to be a kill switch, but rather it was intended to be a check to see if the malware was running in a virtual environment being used for malware analysis. Generally, in automated environments for analysis, there's a kind of a dummy network that's set up that will respond to any kind of a DNS query or any kind of an HTTP connection attempt. The reason for that, of course, is to try to extract information from the malware, to trick it into thinking that it's actually communicating with something real on the network when in fact it isn't, just to see if the researcher can learn anything about it. So this was an instance where it tricked the malware into thinking that it was running in such an environment, and this method was very successfully used to thwart the attack in the relatively early stages. It could have gone on for quite a bit longer if Malware Tech, the now world-famous researcher, hadn't registered those domains and shut down the attack as it was occurring. Now, subsequent to that, a number of other domains began to emerge. You could see them, the bottom 3 that we have over here. There was recent speculation that this might have been an attack that was launched by DPRK, North Korea, just because there were some code components that were seen in there which looked similar to the code that was found in the Sony attack from a couple of years ago, which came from this group called the Lazarus Group. And then some of the variants also were using the kill switch domain that show it's related to Lazarus. The prevailing belief right now is that this is a false flag, and until there's more substantive evidence, it's really not attributable to any group right now. Now, the next thing I want to do is I want to walk you through a Sophos Intercept X root cause analysis view of the malware. Now, you're going to be familiar with many of these steps just because we walked through them in the earlier slides. But let me highlight some sections of the screen over here. I know that there are a lot of elements on this screen here, so I'm just going to try to draw your eye to the more interesting pieces. So what we're doing is we're starting at the root. This is the very, very first event that happened, and we're going to move forward in time with this. So the first thing we see here, and for those of you who could see the color, there's this little red dot on the local security authority subsystem executable. And this is the root event. This is the very first thing that we see happening, because in this particular instance, as in every other that we've looked at, the initial vector was through SMB. So if for example, this attack had come in from email, we would see an earlier root node here. We would see something like Microsoft Outlook, which would then launch something like Microsoft Word if it were a phishing attack in typical sort of scenario where the victim receives an email and it's a document of some sort and they double click on it. We would see those as antecedent events. So the fact that we see LSASS as the entry point over here as the root node tells us that this did in fact come in through SMB. Now the next thing we see is the drop of the MSX service executable, the one that we looked at a little bit earlier. And then this one is going to execute, and it's going to become the parent to this next task, the task scheduler.executable. And then this is the piece that's actually doing the work, the encryption itself. And you could see that in this node over here, which we call the beacon node. And you could see the little blue dot next to it indicating that this is the beacon node. This was the event that tipped us off and told us that something very bad is happening on the system, and that we should then go back into the Sophos data recorder, which you could think of as an historian of events of sort, which we can mine to be able to reconstruct these chains, so that when something bad happens, like this task scheduler executable, touching these 22 files that we see just above it, this is showing us that this is where CryptoGuard kicked in. This is where it recognized that files were being encrypted on the system. It managed to terminate the process, begin the process of cleanup, and then also kick off the mining of the Sophos data recorder so that it can reconstruct this root cause analysis chain. So now I'm going to shift and talk a little bit about the various protection layers that Sophos provided to help to defend against this attack at the various stages. So representative view of what a network will look like here. We'll start at the top with an infected host, and again, understanding that this particular attack came in over the network, over SMB. There are probably not many good reasons why an organization would want to expose SMB directly to the internet, but I'm sure that there are a handful of valid reasons. We believe that many of the organizations that were hit by this were hit because there was some SMB exposure to the internet, or because an infected host was brought in physically, perhaps with an already infected laptop. So once an infection happens, the network is the first layer of defense for this particular exploit. Again, there's malformed SMB packets that are coming in that are attempting to inject the shellcode to kick off this entire process. So the very first way to defend against this is with an intrusion prevention system and a set of rules that are designed to recognize the attack itself. The next stage would be if it has already come into the environment and you want to protect the endpoints themselves. Sophos Endpoint Standard and Advanced offered introduction for all known variants of the attack beginning at about 4 p.m. UTC on Friday. So shortly after the outbreak began, all known variants of the attack were covered through a set of identities and other methods of detection that we were able to introduce. And then finally, perhaps the most effective means of protection against this particular outbreak is Intercept X with our exploit prevention and our CryptoGuard technology. From the very, very first instance, very first occurrence of this in a live environment, CryptoGuard was able to detect it and arrest it from spreading any further. Now, just a little more detail on the signature information. Important to note that this set of signatures were available well in advance of the attack themselves, the attack itself. So these were published back in March for one of the more common forms of the SMB exploit itself. And then a set of other signatures were introduced prior to the attack as well. There were a bunch of additional detections that were released for the IPS platform subsequent to that, and it would attempt to identify different variations of the attack, different variations of the payload, other components that came in through the WannaCry campaign itself. And then additionally, we took the steps of ensuring that those domains, those kill switch domains, were basically whitelisted effectively. And again, it sounds kind of odd to whitelist the domain that is associated with a ransomware attack, but in fact, that is exactly what we needed to do here. we wanted to ensure that every infected endpoint had the opportunity to connect with one of those strange-looking domains, because the moment it did, it would just stop the attack in its tracks. And we wanted to ensure that nobody was accidentally blocking access to what was a very effective kill switch. There were other detections in recognizing the post-infection C2 traffic, for example, from the double pulsar component that was also dropped into this. On the antivirus detection, we had a combination of static detections, which are generic detections for every component of that resource inventory that we were looking at before. The main executable files, the DLLs, some of the helper files, the decryptor tool, the VB script. And these are some of the detection names that were associated with that. And again, these were made available early on May 12th. And then in addition to that, we had a set of runtime detections. And this is for when the code is actually executing. So rather than just being able to statically detect one of the code components, if we fail for some reason on static detection, we then have the ability to see it as it's running in process memory and to determine what the parentage to that process could be also, so that if it were still resident in memory, it could be killed as well. And then finally, we have the CryptoGuard from Intercept X. This offered full protection during the encryption stage in any form of the attack through behavioral detection. It was not signature-based. Again, it's just looking for behavior of some unwanted or illicit process that is attempting to encrypt files in an unusual way on a target system. So the very first thing it would do is it would kill the process that was responsible for the encryption. It would revoke access to it so that it can no longer change any information. It would perform just-in-time backups of the files that were being encrypted. So not a single file was actually lost to the encryption process here. Even though it takes some number of files for CryptoGuard to detect that there is a ransomware process in occurrence, it can actually restore the very, very first file that it saw getting encrypted by the ransomware. And then all of the associated executables and the registry keys were cleaned up by the Sophos Clean component. There's native components within the operating system that would then delete some of the other executables that might have been part of variations of the attack. And then there were additional remnants that were cleaned up. Again, different examples of it behaved in different ways, but as we learned more and more about them, we were able to clean up all of the associated files. Now, I just want to shift here and talk a little bit about the nature of the attack itself. When we see something like this in the industry, we tend to use the term zero-day. And in many ways, I'm sure this did feel like a zero-day, but it's important to look at the details in this chart. If we go back through history, and many of you have been around long enough to remember these, and maybe even some of the worm events that precede these, but over the course of the past 15 years or so, there are three that are particularly memorable. One is the Blaster attack that goes back to 2003. The next was Conficker, which has been kind of the go-to for exploiting a Windows target in the industry. And most recently, we have the WannaCry attack. What we see here is the advisory date in the third column. This is the date that Microsoft made the advisory available, MS 03-026 or MS 08067. And then the next column is the campaign date. When did we actually start seeing this campaign in the wild? And then the next column over is the delta. What is the difference between the date that Microsoft issued the advisory, made the patch available, and the time that we actually saw the campaign starting? And we see that we're not dealing with 0 days here. In fact, we're dealing with a 26-day in the Blaster case, a 28-day in the Conficker case, and a 59-day in the WannaCry case. And then the last column just shows us the number of infected users that we've seen. And the number in the third row there, unfortunately, is still rising, albeit very, very slowly at this point. So this is not a matter of weaponizing a 0 day and getting it out there to launch a campaign like this. What this is, in part at least, is failure to get systems patched quickly enough. Now, it's quite easy at this point to victim blame, to point the finger and to say, some of these target organizations really ought to have done a better job retiring their out-of-support XP or 2K3 systems. They really ought to have done a better job applying their patches. Now, sure, that's very sensible, and everybody should be doing this to the extent that they can. But there are in fact instances where it's simply impractical to impossible for them to be able to do so. So we can't always say that patching could solve the problem, because sometimes patching just isn't possible. So therefore, there are an additional set of steps and protections that we need to do when we find ourselves in these sorts of environments. And the last slide that I want to leave you with before I turn this back over to Marty to make a set of recommendations about how we can better protect ourselves is this. This is from one of the shadow brokers' archives, one of the earlier troves that came out when this was first released for auction. And what we see here is that there are about 30 different exploits that were included in this. The one that this attack was using, again, was the one in the center here, Eternal Blue. It's just one of the Eternals. The Eternal naming scheme seems to be associated with SMB. We see here Eternal Romance, for example, and then we have Eternal Champion. They have largely been patched. Like if you look at the Microsoft advisory numbers for many of these, we see MS09, so this is back in 2009. We see that some of them are targeting Windows 2003 servers, so some of them appear to be quite old. But there's still reason to believe that many of these systems are out in the wild, many of these systems are still unpatched. And every time an attacker figures out how to weaponize one of these exploits, it generally has, in these cases at least, remote code execution capabilities. It can be spread over the internet if those ports are unprotected. And it can cause the kind of mass propagation that we saw in this instance. The other thing to keep in mind is that it's not just SMB. There are RDP, remote desktop protocol attacks that are listed in here as well. There are some rumblings in the industry now that this one here, a Steam audit, is actually gearing up for a campaign against vulnerable Windows 2003 servers. So the message is that we probably haven't seen the last of this. And then the most recent rumor is that the Shadow Brokers organization is going to start a new Dump of the Month Club, they've decided to call it, where kind of like a Wine of the Month Club, they're going to make dumps of new exploit tools available to subscribers every single month. And they're claiming that they have a trove of tools that they've stolen from the Equation Group, the NSA, and some other organizations that are going to at least rival the set that we see here. Now, they are criminals, of course, so everything they say ought to be taken with a grain of salt, but they have demonstrated 4 times now that they actually deliver on the goods. Therefore, we have reason to believe that, there could be some validity to the claim that they're making. And with that, I'm going to turn it back over to Marty to give you a set of recommendations on how to best protect yourself.
All right, thanks, Joe. Appreciate it. That was fantastic. I hope everyone really enjoyed that. That was really a great deep dive into what happened. So yeah, Joe gave some recommendations along the way. Obviously, we've been, using our customers with Intercept X. Of course, had this completely blocked. But here's some core recommendations you can use. Right. Obviously, update all your Windows environments. Right. Microsoft Security Bulletin MS17-10 lays that out, and you'll see this is hyperlinked on this slide. Where you can find all these recommendations is actually on our website at sophos.com/wanna with 2 N's, so that way you can get to this hyperlink. But Microsoft patched this back in March, right, as Joe mentioned. So, this is one way to protect against this stuff. Obviously, close ports on your firewall. We've got a question coming up for you, Joe, on the ports that we saw while you were talking. So clearly you want to close ports on your firewall and your remote desktop port there, and always use VPN for remote site access. Whitelist any kill switch domains. Joe showed those kill switch domains in the presentation. Obviously you want to whitelist those. Clearly update your endpoint software to ensure you have the latest protections, right? Ours was updated just a couple hours after the event started striking in the UK last Friday. Ensure you're running the most advanced ransomware protection. So antivirus and signature-based detection is great for blocking known threats. Intercept X and Sophos Exploit Prevention is great for blocking unknown 0 days, and they worked perfectly in this situation. So our customers with those products already will tell you exactly that. Home users who are maybe using Sophos Home, there is a new Sophos Home Premium version that's in beta right now that includes this capability to block unknown ransomware capability like this. So feel free to add this beta anytime you want. This is a free download. So you can go to the Sophos Home site and download and get this protection for your home systems as well. So I hope those recommendations are helpful, and I hope you enjoyed everything that Joe talked about so far. We're going to open it up for a few questions right now. If we slip, let's go to the next slide, actually, Joe, one last slide. So we're going to open it up for a little Q&A.
Absolutely.
Yep. Thank you.
Oh, sorry, Marty. Didn't mean to jump on you then. Yes, we've got quite a few questions that have come across. So just want to tell everybody we're doing our best to weed through them and make sure to serve up ones that we think will be really valuable for the whole audience. But if you have questions that are specific to yours, we've tried to answer them live, but go ahead and keep sending them across. We will be capturing all of these questions and passing them on to teams within Sophos to follow up with you directly if your question is more of an individual nature. So I think one of the first questions that we wanted to open up was just about the support, and Marty, I'm going to position this question to you, the support of the Intercept X product and CryptoGuard in particular running on systems beyond Windows. Can you talk to the roadmap or the plans for that?
Sure, yeah, no problem. So yeah, Intercept X, which includes this CryptoGuard product for anti-ransomware, has been on Windows since, September, October last year. We're adding it for Mac, and actually some of you are probably already in the early access program if you've been using it already. So it's available for Mac in the early access program, and it will be generally available, I want to say any day now, but I'm going to buffer myself just to be safe. I'll say early June, but we are real close to GA on that one as well.
Yeah, and I know they're working hard to get it out across given the level of protection we've seen it's providing for our customers.
Yeah.
Another question is about given the private encryption key that was owned by the attacker in the case of this threat and not found anywhere, is the only recovery a backup copy of your data?
At this point, we believe that that is the only means of recovery. Nobody has given up on this yet, and the entire research community is still working hard on it. We've got our best cryptographers looking at it inside Sophos Labs. So I won't say never, but as of right now, that is the best method of recovery.
And a couple follow-up questions that relate to that is regarding the last date to pay the ransom. One attendee said that they had heard tomorrow was the ransom date. Have you heard anything specific on that, or is it set based on whenever the encryption took place or the attack hit?
The variants that we've seen are all showing the same final date. So yeah, that's our current understanding.
Oh, they are all seeing the same final date?
Well, depending on when it was started.
Got it. But sort of like a time clock.
Yep.
And Joe, for you on that, do you expect follow-on or copycat attacks on the back end of this? It feels like things have calmed a little bit for people in the front lines, but what are your thoughts on what's to come?
Yeah, we unfortunately believe that we are going to see quite a few copycat attacks. The tools are in the wild at this point. They have been further weaponized and simplified, given that the Eternal Blue attack and a number of the other exploits were incorporated into the Metasploit platform now, is going to make it even more broadly available than it had been before. So unfortunately, we believe that this is just the first wave.
Getting to the next question, I apologize that. Bear with me just a moment. Since SMB is the entry point, does this mean the infected machines were open to the internet on port 139, for example?
We believe so, and this one would attempt connections on 445. But yeah, we suspect that it was either an open connection to the internet, where through that IP randomization it just happened to have found a target, or it was an already infected machine that was brought into an environment. The thing to keep in mind too is that of the organizations that we now understand were hit by this, most of them were quite large, it's only reasonable to think that the larger the surface area of the organization, the more likely it is that they're going to have a misconfigured firewall somewhere, and they're going to have hosts that are accessible over the internet, allowing inbound SMB communications to happen. So in this instance, at least, being a smaller organization would reduce the surface area and would probably reduce the chance of being hit by the propagation stages.
Mm-hmm. And another question about the investigation is, during your investigation, did you encounter the cryptocurrency miner, I'm going to Adelkaz, that was being used, that was using the same vulnerability?
Yeah, we have seen reports of that, and they are being reported in the wild. It hasn't been nearly as large as the WannaCrypt campaign that we saw, though.
And on Marty, this is a question for you. On the back end of the discovery, what has been incorporated into Sophos endpoint products beyond Intercept X? So knowing that Intercept X was the one that from first sight prevented the ransomware, what about the endpoint products, the traditional signature-based products and other elements that are out there?
Yeah, no, great question. So yeah, in addition to Intercept X blocking it initially at a 0-day, we then turned around and added signatures into our core endpoint products within a couple hours, really, of the first instance of the attack. So anyone upgrading immediately would have been protected by that as well. In addition, Joe mentioned earlier our IPS capability within our firewall and UTM would block any spread of this infection also. So we have multiple technologies that would have prevented this from spreading and getting into organizations.
And can you talk about how this would work for file servers as well?
Yeah, actually good news there for those of you who maybe are already running it. We've added our CryptoGuard capability into our server protection as also. So any servers that have been protected by CryptoGuard would have blocked this, of course, instantly, and anyone who wants to protect their servers moving forward should take a look at our server protection because it includes this.
Great. Keep coming. I'm seeing a couple of questions that come across about individual evaluations of your own security status with Sophos to contact you. If anyone would like that, please let us know. Again, redirecting you to the Wanna landing page, which will help you with the whitelist for the kill switch, access to the Intercept X free trial, the Sophos home product. A couple questions came back around consumer users, so just redirecting you to Marty's comment about the premium version of Sophos Home for your at-home use, as well as to let everybody know that we are recording today's webinar and it will be available offline. We're going to work really hard to get this back out and turned around ideally by first thing tomorrow. So for any of you that want to revisit this content with your colleagues or missed any portion of it, we'll make sure that this information is sent back around. I think just one last question for you, Marty, is just talking about some of the responses that we've seen in the media. There were a couple of questions that came across about specific Sophos customers and their level of protection, and whether or not they were using this product or that product or the other. And just wondering if you wanted to comment on anything that around that.
Yeah, sure. So, our customers have various levels of protection, various levels of products of ours in their environment, and some large customers, of course, have our products and other products in that environment. So, a couple comments there is very large organizations typically have multiple products, right? Anyone that had our Intercept product or had our IPS capability was absolutely protected. Nothing got through there. So, in fact, we had one customer who recently called us yesterday and said, not only did you guys block everything and it was a non-event for me, but my boss asked me about it, and when I told him that you blocked everything, he said, roll Sophos out everywhere then. So this guy wants Intercept everywhere, which is great.
And in the case of, I'm kind of summarizing a couple of people's questions with an effort to try and get to as much as possible, but in the case of Intercept X kicking in based on the encryption, what happens to those files if Intercept X is only kicking in after it's recognizing a certain amount of encryption occurring?
Oh yeah, in fact that's exactly how it works. It looks at encryption processes that are happening within the system and quickly determines whether it's a legitimate or malicious encryption process. And so what it will do is, as it starts to look at those processes, it creates an automatic backup for you of those files in real time. So it typically only takes 1, 2, or 3 files before we recognize, hey, it's a malicious encryption process. And we'll have backup copies that were automatically made before the encryption took place, so that once we determine, yes, it's malicious, we'll roll back those 1 to 3 files back into their original backup copy, so that you're fully protected. So that's how it works.
Great. And for customers that are actually looking from a data protection perspective for encryption solutions, protecting data at rest and in motion, sitting on servers or SANs, what Sophos solution would you recommend for that?
So I hope I'm interpreting it correctly. So
yeah, this is someone who's looking to proactively encrypt their data.
Yeah. So we have a couple file. Obviously, disk encryption and file encryption solutions are safeguard encryption capability, and what it effectively does is manage encryption. For disk encryption, for instance, it will manage the keys and manage the encryption engines of both BitLocker and FileVault 2 on Apple and Windows, of course. Our file encryption solution is something that people should really look into, because it will encrypt data everywhere, from obviously from laptops and desktops to mobile device workspaces and cloud environments, and it does it automatically in a very interesting approach, rather than what I'll call the traditional approach of trying to determine what data is important and then just encrypting that. We can set it up where it's automatically encrypts everything you create, because we assume it's important, and it's transparent to users, so they don't even know they're sharing encrypted files back and forth, but they're automatically protected. So it's really easy to set up and really easy to get going.
And another question, actually, back to Intercept X, is whether or not, one question I can answer is based on education pricing. We do have education pricing in the US and Canada for Intercept X, so just contact your partner or software sales representative to connect you with a partner for specifics on that, or we can reach back out for you. The other follow-up question from the same attendee was whether or not Intercept X, quote, plays nice with third-party or other AV vendors.
Yes, it does. We actually test it with multiple AV vendors, and have an ongoing list of who we know we've tested with and who we're already interoperating with in many customer environments. So yes, it has never had a problem in that kind of situation. Yep.
Okay, great. I think we've captured most of the questions that we're going to try and hit. Oh, actually, I've got one more. Is you were showing some of the root cause analysis, and so I'll kick this question to Marty, but Joe, feel free to weigh in if you have any other input on it. Was whether or not the root cause analysis helped track how the attack occurred for an end user, someone using Intercept X?
Oh, yeah. I can give you the short answer, and then Joe can probably give you a better answer. But yeah, I've seen some really phenomenal root cause analysis graphs on this attack, and how it happened and how just complex they got. It was really interesting how much it spread.
Mm-hmm. Joe, any other comments you'd add on root cause analysis being able to help track how the attack occurred? I mean, other than the answer Marty provided,
Yeah, we have seen some pretty interesting looking graphs on this one, and others as well. In general, we are better at detecting when a bad thing has happened than we are at understanding how the bad thing happened in the first place, and that's why something like root cause analysis is so valuable. It enables us not to just be able to respond to something as it's occurring in real time or near real time, but then it allows us to say what was it in our organization that was allowing this to occur in the first place. What sort of a vulnerability was there, or what sort of user behavior was there that enabled the attack to make it into the environment in the first place. And it gives you a very specific way to then go back and remediate what that underlying vulnerability that was exploited was, whether it's a component of technology or whether it's one of your users. So yeah, it's quite valuable, not in just stopping things, but in stopping them at their root.
Great. Good. Well, we'll keep leaving the session open for a little bit. I do want to make sure everybody also has seen access to the recorded video that's out on YouTube that shows some of the RCA for WannaCry, and you can just go to the Sophos channel on YouTube. I think we've got at least a couple of videos up on this particular attack. Is that right, Marty?
Yes, absolutely. It should be very helpful. Yep.
Okay, great. Good. So there's a number of resources. The sophos.com/WANNA takes you to kind of the big overview, links to the knowledge base article, as well as more information from Naked Security, the 5 elements of recommendations that we have for it, and should hopefully get you connected with all of the follow-up that many of you have asked about. But if there are any outstanding questions we haven't answered, send them over through the chat and Q&A window. And I want to thank our participants in today's presentation. Joe, it was a real pleasure and honor to have you on to address this very critical and widespread issue. So thank you for your time and attention today. And Marty, thank you as well for helping to frame it out for us. And for everyone who joined us on the line, thank you for your time, and we look forward to speaking with you soon.